Colleagues, I would urge them to oppose the gentleman's amendment, I want to thank all those who've worked with the Appalachian Regional Commission, particularly in my own state. I know it's not always easy, and we want to do what we can to support them. So I yield back my remaining time, Madam Chair.
The gentlelady from Ohio yields back her time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alabama seek recognition?
Strike last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I want to rise in opposition to this amendment as well. As has been noted here, this was created in 1965 as the ARC, and it is a real proven track record of success in creating economic development in an area of the country that faces unique challenges. And again, it creates economic development. I think that needs to be stressed. It's not a handout, but it's a way to try to make investment into a region of the country that really can use some economic development encouragement, and that's exactly what this program does. As a result of this of ARC funding, the regional poverty rate has been cut almost in half. Infant mortality rates have been reduced, and job-creating infrastructure has provided new and improved water and sewer services to over 112,000 residents, and that's just in the last 5 years. Despite the tremendous progress that this program has made over the years, there's challenges that still exist. This region has lost roughly 1/4 of its manufacturing jobs, and nearly 1/4 of Appalachia's counties still suffer from severe and persistent economic distress. So now is not the time to zero out this effective program, especially when you're focusing on economic development. Now more than ever, we must empower local communities and regional planning commissions to utilize this much-needed federal assistance and provide the basic building blocks for regional economic development. So I would strongly urge my colleagues to vote no on the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Ohio. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Ohio will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Mr.
Madam Chair.
Butterfield of North Carolina.
Madam Chair, I ask that the amendment be considered as read. I reserve.
Is there objection?
Madam Chair, I reserve a
Without objection? For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I reserve a point of order on the gentleman's amendment.
The point of order is reserved. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I am very disappointed, to say the least, that significant cuts are being proposed to reduce funding for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. But with that in mind, I've come to the floor this evening with an idea that I think could mitigate the effects of those cuts. My amendment has no cost. I will begin by saying that. My amendment has no cost associated with it. It simply expresses the sense of Congress that the Army Corps of Engineers should consider and prioritize projects that mitigate the danger of natural disasters. Eastern North Carolina is especially vulnerable to extreme weather events, and other states have the same vulnerability. The Corps works to improve the safety of communities near the Neuse River in Goldsboro, North Carolina, and in Princeville, where Hurricane Floyd all but destroyed the town because of the rapidly rising and poorly contained Tar River. My amendment would give added confidence to my constituents in North Carolina and to many of your constituents as well, that the federal government is doing everything possible to protect and reinforce communities and neighborhoods from natural disasters. For several years, the nation has witnessed the widespread devastation caused by these disasters. Hurricanes Sandy and Irene are just two examples. Communities affected by natural disasters like those in my district face a long recovery filled with hardship and painful dilemmas. The underlying bill we are discussing today cuts $104 million in civil projects of the Corps, and it rescinds $200 million in previously appropriated funding. At the same time, the Corps has a $60 million backlog of projects, and some of my colleagues have referenced that tonight. Many of these are important places like my district and many of yours as well that experience frequent storms. Due to insufficient funding and a prohibition on new construction, no new projects have been initiated by the Corps since the year 2010. The Corps has many important responsibilities, but none more so than its effort to mitigate flood and storm dangers. The Corps provides essential mitigation assistance, such as repairing damaged levees and providing emergency water supplies to communities in need. It also works to engineer infrastructure that will prevent some of the effects of natural disasters. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has predicted an especially active hurricane season with up to 11 hurricanes and up to 16 major hurricanes in the 6-month hurricane season. The number of predicted storms is significantly greater than the seasonal average of 6 and 3 majors. NOAA has also indicated that hurricanes threaten inland islands through rain and strong winds and flooding, as we saw in many communities. Never has funding and support for the Corps been more critical to my constituents and the many areas throughout the country. So as we consider a bill that plans to reduce funding for the Corps, we must keep in mind the communities who may suffer, and many who have spoken tonight come from those districts. They suffer the most from this type of activity. I remind my colleagues that this amendment costs no money whatsoever. A no vote on the amendment does carry the cost of heavy inaction. And so I want to thank you. I ask the chair to overrule the point of order. The gentleman, the chairman of the subcommittee mentioned earlier that he supports the Corps and funding for the Corps. And this is simply an effort to try to instruct the Corps to prioritize the projects as they make these difficult decisions. Thank you for listening to my colleagues. I would yield back at this time.
From North Carolina yields back the balance of his time. Does the gentleman from New Jersey insist on his point of order?
Yes, Madam Chair, I do.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Chair, I make a point of order against the amendment because it proposes to change existing law and constitute legislation on an appropriation bill, and therefore violates Clause 2 of Rule 21. The rule states in the pertinent part, an amendment to a general appropriation bill shall not be in order if changing existing law. The amendment proposes to state a legislative position. I'm asking for a ruling from the chair.
Does any member wish to be heard on the point of order? If not, the chair is prepared to rule. The amendment offered by the gentleman from North Carolina proposes to state a legislative position of the House. As such, the amendment constitutes legislation in violation of Clause 2 of Rule 21. The point of order is sustained and the amendment is not in order. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek
Madam Chair,
recognition?
my friend Mr. Duffy from Wisconsin and I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report. Will the gentleman specify the amendment?
Yes. It's do you have the list of it? Amendment to H.R. 2609.
That was specific.
It's amendment number 20 in the congressional
record. The clerk
record.
will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 20, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mr. Kelly of Pennsylvania.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The reason I'm here tonight is to talk about the efforts that are being used to divert harbor maintenance trust fund monies to purposes other than what Congress intended, and that is dredging and maintenance of our harbors. Now, all I'm talking about I'm talking about fairness and I'm talking about commerce. And we all know, we've known for years that if we have a problem when funds are collected for an intended purpose, sometimes they don't get used that way. So we have money in, but money does not come out the way it was put in or for its intended use. Now, there's a number of reasons for this happening. But until we get more funds for their intended purpose, I oppose, and Mr. Duffy and I oppose, expanding the authorities for the use of this funding. This is a matter of fairness. Now, the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund has carried a surplus since 1997. At the end of fiscal year 2012, the trust fund had an estimated $7 billion surplus that was not spent on harbor maintenance. Yet our harbors are under-maintained. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has estimated that full channel dimensions at the nation's busiest 59 ports are available less than 35% of the time. That's unacceptable, and just from an economic standpoint, should be unacceptable to us. Ships, especially those in my district and throughout the Great Lakes, are light loading. When that happens, economic productivity is lost. Light loading, we can't even load the ships to their capacity because we haven't maintained our harbors, we haven't dredged our harbors. This is an affront to commerce. It goes back to the very beginning of what the Founding Fathers thought about. Commerce is so important, getting products from point A to point B. Now, Mr. Chairman, we must ensure that the monies intended for dredging are not siphoned off for other reasons. Our amendment will prohibit monies from being used by the administration to expand the authorized uses of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund monies. Now, I know this is something that the gentleman, my good friend from New Jersey, has supported in the past, and I appreciate his consideration. Now, I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania yields back the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of the Kelly-Duffy amendment here, which will prohibit expanded uses of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund at the current appropriations level. Let me be clear. The needs of the nation's ports and harbors are great, and they're largely unmet today. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has made a valiant effort to maintain these facilities, which are essential for American manufacturers and the business community to access markets around the world. We're talking about jobs. We're talking about business income here in every state, in every congressional district in this country. Beginning in 1997, however, as Mr. Kelly just pointed out, both Congress and the administration since that time have fallen short of allocating the entire balance of the Harbor Trust Fund monies to a current rate of less than 50% of the total revenues received. Tragically, as a result, we've fallen seriously behind in our essential harbor maintenance. If we were to restore full funding today, the Army Corps estimates it would take 5 years to catch up on the backlog in our nation's busiest ports, and another 5 years to catch up on the nation's smaller ports, which are nevertheless essential to local and regional economies. Madam Chair, channel dredging is the most critical factor in maintaining our harbors. To be sure, there are other needs. In 2011, the Army Corps suggested that this fund could be used to increase harbor security. Certainly access roads and other harbor facilities need constant maintenance. But if we expand the use of these funds without expanding the total funds appropriated, we will simply add to our current backlog, choke off future commerce, and cost the American economy the jobs that we desperately need. The Port of Duluth in my district is already restricting outbound shipments to 80% of the capacity because of this backlog and maintaining proper channel depth. How can we justify forcing our merchant fleet to operate at less than full efficiency? Madam Chair, I urge my Democratic colleagues here to support this amendment and help us prevent a bad situation from getting worse. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. For what does the gentlelady from Ohio seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I'm more than happy to yield to the Congressman Kelly offering the amendment, Congressman Nolan speaking on the amendment, and to say that this Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, and this amendment gives us an opportunity to talk about that, and the importance to all of our harbors, including those in the Great Lakes. And I spoke earlier today, I said, I don't know how long it's going to take to narrow the channel anymore. Some of the ports I represent, what's been happening is that with less money, the width has been narrowing. I said, so maybe our ships will actually look like this someday rather than having a bow that looks like this, because there just simply aren't enough funds to dredge all of the ports that are necessary. And in fact, there have been some harbors that have actually shut down. So this gives us an opportunity to talk about the necessity of a review of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund and its future use and what we might do in order to get a better allocation to our accounts so that we can take care of all of these ports that are being pressed around the country. And I wanted to, if the gentlemen have anything additional they'd like to put on the record at this point regarding the ports in the Great Lakes or elsewhere, I would be more than pleased to yield time to them.
Madam Chair, I thank Representative. I would just add that it's costing business and commerce throughout the country in the Great Lakes billions of dollars. This is critical, essential infrastructure, and we look forward to working with you to find a way to release that trust fund for what it was intended, which is the dredging of our harbors. It's so critical to our commerce, our business, our jobs, our economies, and
Reassuming my time, I hope the administration is hearing this and the Corps is hearing this, and they work with us on a better allocation and not invading the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund for other purposes. I would hate to deny the administration the right to think about this and to make recommendations to us. I don't think it's the gentleman's intent from Pennsylvania, Congressman Kelly, to prevent any oversight or activities by the administration to better manage the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. I don't think that is his intent. I think his intent is to assure that these dollars are spent for harbor maintenance, but if in fact the administration has a good idea they want to throw in to help us with this, you wouldn't deny them the right to do that, am I correct, in asking the gentleman that question? You wouldn't, we need their cooperation in order to make this work.
Well, Madam Chair, they're already neglecting the needs for dredging in our harbors, and to divert funds from the existing appropriations that are available would only make the situation worse, which is why I rise in support of the gentleman's amendment. And I know Mr. Duffy wishes to speak to the amendment as well.
Yes, I think the gentleman will have to move to strike the last word and obtain his own 5 minutes. But Mr. Congressman Kelly, your intention is not to preclude the administration from working with us on the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund if they have a creative idea that would help us.
Will the gentlewoman yield to me? Will the gentleman yield to me, please?
I'm
okay, yes.
trying
Listen,
to.
I think the whole purpose of this, and Sean's going to have a chance to speak next, this money is collected for a specific reason. I had a conversation with Secretary LaHood talking about why can't we use the money that's been collected and set aside and to be used. This is about commerce. This is about fairness. This is about growing our economy and being able to have access to the entire world. We're letting these harbors go unmaintained. We're not dredging them, and we're causing a huge problem in commerce. That's the problem. We can't get from point A to point B. We're lowering the efficiency of our businesses and our ability to get products out there. No, the whole purpose of this is to use the money that's collected for the intention that it was collected. It's money that's going in but not being used the right way, and I don't want to see that get diverted any other ways than we've seen happen already. We're already missing the boat, no pun intended. But we're closing down these harbors and we're not doing the right thing by them. So, I don't know, Mr. Chairman, did you have anything else that you wanted to add? If not, I wanted my friend from Wisconsin, Mr. Duffy, to have a chance to talk. So.
All right. I would.
It's the gentlelady from Ohio time.
So I yield back my time to Ms. Kemp.
I would yield back my remaining time.
The gentlelady from Ohio yields back the remainder of her time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And maybe I could address a few of the concerns or issues that were brought up from the gentlelady from Ohio. I think everyone who supports this amendment is willing to work with the administration if the administration wants to work with us to start to dredge our ports, to make sure that we can actually have more flow of commerce through the American ports that haven't been serviced well. If the administration wants to tap into the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund and use those resources for other purposes, I think you would see a strong objection from those who support this amendment, because those of us who especially live in the Great Lakes, Mr. Nolan and I, the gentleman from Minnesota, have the great honor of sharing the Duluth Superior Port. We understand how important dredging is to making sure that port functions. And when we don't have enough resources going in to service our port, it gives us great pause, because these are jobs in our community. This is economic growth in our community. And if we don't have that, we're concerned. So if the administration is willing to work with us, we are willing to work with the administration, no doubt. But again, if they want to take those resources and use them for another purpose, we would have great cause and pushback, because what you've seen with the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund is that it's funded by the shippers. They pay taxes, they pay fees in the anticipation that those dollars, those revenues, are going to be used to service our ports. The problem is it hasn't been used to service our ports. So they're paying money into a fund that over the last 15 years has run a surplus. And now there's $7 billion in the fund, and they sit back and they scratch their head and they wonder, why isn't this money being used for its intended purpose, which is to make sure American ports work? We've paid for it. We've agreed to pay the taxes. Now do, government, what you've promised us to do, which use it to make sure that we can actually have commerce in our industry. I think it's important. The gentleman from Pennsylvania also talked about the Corps of Engineers doing studies and talking about our shippers having a light load, talking about the Great Lakes ports, talking about Duluth Superior, the Twin Ports, where they're unable to load at full capacity because we haven't effectively dredged that port. And that's loss of revenue for our shippers. But not only that, that's driving up the cost of the goods that we're shipping on the Great Lakes, which mean the end consumer is paying more for those goods. This doesn't make a lot of economic sense, especially, again, when we have $7 billion of surplus in that fund. This is one of those issues where I think government can do a better job serving the people. Putting money into a fund, paying taxes to specifically go into a fund for a specific purpose, and then have that fund raided and robbed and used for a different purpose is unconscionable. It's unacceptable, and that's not the agreement Americans here in the shipping industry had with their government. It's unfair at best. Just to maybe make one last point, this is a jobs amendment. This amendment will, again, make sure that we can have a growing, effective, efficient economy and shipping in the ports across the country, but it also makes sure that we have lower cost goods because we're effectively using our ports and our shippers across this country. And would the gentlelady from Ohio like me to yield?
Just for 30 seconds.
I would yield to the gentlelady.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And just to say, I'm really glad we've had this discussion tonight. Others have heard it. I think it'll help encourage administration cooperation, being a representative who has the ports of Lake Erie in her district, Cleveland, Lorain, Sandusky, Toledo, and many points in between. I fully understand the challenge here. One of our budgetary challenges is that we have to have a budget that allocates these dollars, and right now that hasn't come from your side of the aisle. So in order to use these dollars, it has to be incorporated in the budget resolution that comes to us. Our mark was too low in our bill in order to be able to move those dollars. So let's work on that with the budget committees as well so that we get that allocation and it comes to our subcommittee. And that's something that we can all work on both sides of the aisle.
I'll reclaim my time. Point well made by the gentlelady from Ohio. And just to make sure we're clear, this amendment is one that prohibits additional or expansion of the definition of use for the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. So we can't use it for other purposes than for the ports, which was the original intent. And with that, I yield.
The gentleman from Wisconsin yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
I move, Madam Chair, to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise to enter into colloquy with the distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, the chairman of the Energy and Water Appropriations Subcommittee, Mr. Freeling-Heisen. Virginia is proud to be home of one of the department's flagship national labs in nuclear physics, the Thomas Jefferson National Accelerator Facility, or JLab, located in Newport News. In its primary scientific facility, they're known as the Continuous Electron Beam Accelerator Facility. In fact, the nuclear physics community so values the work at the JLab that they recommended a major upgrade to its accelerator, what's referred to as the 12 GeV project, as its #1 priority in their 2007 long-range plan for nuclear physics. That upgrade has received over 70% of its construction funding through the tireless efforts of the subcommittee, and work is going to begin there on its commissioning in fiscal year 2014. That is provided that sufficient funding is included in this appropriations measure. I'm really grateful that the construction funding that is provided in the bill is at the level requested by the administration. However, I am concerned that the proposed reductions for nuclear physics below the budget request could force unilateral cuts in medium energy nuclear physics operations, and that these reductions could delay the start of the commissioning of the 12 GeV project, which is scheduled to start in the first quarter of fiscal year 2014. Therefore, I'm asking the chairman if he would be willing to work with me and my colleagues in Virginia and others who support the priorities of the nuclear physics community to work towards completing this important construction project and to begin operations in a timely fashion.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, certainly.
I thank my colleague for his interest and strong advocacy on behalf of the Jefferson Lab and for the nuclear physics program. Our allocation has made for some tough choices, and we worked hard to fund the Office of Science at $32 million above current levels post-sequester. This level of funding is sufficient to support a $7.5 million increase for the medium energy nuclear physics program, which goes to the Jefferson Lab. I want to thank my colleague for his advocacy and look forward to working with him to support this vital program through the appropriations process. I also assure my colleague that the bill keeps CBAF on track to begin operations in fiscal year 2014, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding initially. I thank him for his leadership, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The remainder of his time. Who seeks recognition?
Thank you very much.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? The clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Mr. LaMalfa of California. At the end of the bill, before the short title, insert the following section. None of the funds made available by this act may be used to regulate activities identified in subparagraphs A and C of Section 404F1 of the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, 33 United States Code 1344F1AC.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm pleased to be able to present this amendment here. Thank you, the Chairman of the committee, for allowing this. We have a situation here where Section 404F1 of the Clean Water Act exempts certain activities from the permitting requirements under Section 404, including normal farming, forestry, and ranching activities, and construction, maintenance of farm, forest roads, irrigation ditches, and farm ponds. In 1977, Congress made a deliberate policy choice to amend the Clean Water Act to provide carefully tailored exemptions for these ordinary activities of farmers, ranchers, and foresters from the costly and burdensome requirements to obtain Clean Water Act permits. Despite this clear expression of congressional intent, however, the Corps of Engineers and the EPA in recent years have been trying to circumvent the 404 F1 permitting exemptions by attempting to interpret a limited recapture provision in Section 404 F2 in such an expansive way as to virtually swallow up the exemptions in 404 F1. As a result, we have a situation where Congress clearly provided a regulatory exemption from permitting in one paragraph of the Clean Water Act, only to have the Corps and EPA now take it away through a creative interpretation of the next paragraph. The Corps and EPA cannot take away administratively what Congress gave legislatively. These administrative efforts to undermine congressional intent have resulted in excessive and overzealous efforts to expand regulatory powers into farming and ranching activities exempted from regulation. In one instance, a family farm attempted to convert pasture land irrigated by ditch to a piped irrigation system to improve their water efficiency, a laudable goal from any perspective. This is an activity clearly exempted from regulation by Section 404 F1, yet the core argument that potential runoff from this work, which would run into a man-made drainage ditch and eventually into a terminal man-made pond with no outlet, would impact somehow the navigable waterway of the Sacramento River, which is over 6 miles away, which really bears no relation to reality with this regulation. This claim by the Corps turned a one-day, $2,500 project into now a multi-year legal battle resulting in over $100,000 in legal costs to the family farm, all with no improvement or protection of the environment. This amendment is intended to make it clear that the Corps is not to use any funds to regulate activities that are already excluded from regulation under Section 404 F1, A, and C of the Clean Water Act, and that the recapture provision in Section 404 F2 is not to be used to undermine those sections of 404 F1 permitting exemptions. The amendment allows that the permitting exemptions to stand on their own merits without the Corps and EPA negating their use through clever legal interpretations. In no way does this amendment attack or limit regulation of wetlands or our nation's waterways. As a rancher myself, with wetlands, ducks, other wildlife on my land, I know full well the importance and value of reasonable protections for our natural resources. Today, farms in California and elsewhere are being targeted for simply changing crops or irrigation methods. They're doing their best to follow every law, the spirit of the law, but are being targeted for something Congress explicitly exempted. This amendment simply limits funds to ensure that agencies of government only spend money to follow the laws as Congress wrote them. I urge all members to please support this amendment. I reserve my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman cannot reserve his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I have no objection to the gentleman's amendment. Our colleague from California describes yet another troubling example of what seems to be federal overreach, regulatory overreach. I support his amendment, which I think will address the situation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey yields back the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio
Yes,
seek
I move
recognition?
to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise to oppose the gentleman's amendment. If the proposed amendment would take effect, the Corps would be prohibited from requiring a permit for discharges into waters of the United States from certain agricultural activities. The Clean Water Act already exempts certain agricultural activities from regulation unless those activities change the flow of navigable waters. Then those agricultural activities, such as construction of stock ponds or irrigation ditches, construction of forest roads, and reconstruction of recently damaged parts of levees, dikes, and dams, must be regulated. The Clean Water Act already exempts agriculture business from many of the regulations imposed on others. This amendment would take away the common sense safeguards built into the Clean Water Act to prevent the negative impact of some agricultural activities, and we have all been witness to some of those. So I believe the Clean Water Act strikes the right balance in giving relief to agricultural businesses already, and therefore urge defeat of the amendment, and I yield back my remaining time.
The gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Iowa seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Mr. King of Iowa. At the end of the bill before the short title, insert the following section. None of the funds made available in this act to the United States Army Corps of Engineers may be used for sediment or soil dumping into the Missouri River.
The gentleman from Iowa is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have a situation that exists in Iowa, Nebraska, and Missouri that I know of along the Missouri River, which I've represented the entire stretch along Iowa. It's an attempt to save the endangered species known as the pallid sturgeon, and I brought a little sample of him here. He's the only one in congressional captivity. And this came from the hatchery of U.S. Fish and Wildlife, by the way. But what they're doing is an attempt to create shallow water habitat so this pallid sturgeon can reproduce. They're opening up the old oxbows, and that's all right. But what they're doing is dredging millions of cubic yards of dredge spoil out of those old channels into the river channel itself. And we know that dredge spoil is listed under the Clean Water Act as a toxic pollutant. They wouldn't let farmers do it. They wouldn't let contractors do it. The Corps of Engineers doesn't need to. They have better alternatives that are consistent with the Clean Water Act. So my amendment simply says none of the funds can be used to dredge this into the river, and they would need to follow their own rules like everybody else does. And I urge the adoption of this amendment, and I would yield back the balance of my time.
Of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have any objection to the amendment, although I do have a few concerns which I'd like to cover. First of all, I want to thank my colleague for bringing these issues to our attention. If, in fact, the Corps' actions are detrimental to flood control efforts in his region, those types of actions need to be stopped, and I would be happy to work with him to do that. I do believe, of course, that some of these issues would be better dealt with by the authorizing committees that have jurisdiction over the Corps and the Endangered Species Act. So I think there are some concerns that we have that are legitimate here. We're going to do some more investigation and work with the gentleman to see if we can address his concerns. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey yields back the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes, the King Amendment would provide no funds to be used for shallow water habitat construction if that involves sediment or soil dumping into the Missouri River. In order to meet the obligations established within the 2003 amended biological opinion, the construction of shallow water habitat is an integral part of compliance. There are two ways to build shallow water habitats, either through flow actions or through mechanical actions. The Corps has been implementing habitat construction to avoid manipulating flows, mainly because of concerns expressed by the state of Missouri. This amendment would prevent the construction of shallow water habitat, leaving the pallid sturgeon fish unprotected. I understand that farmers in Iowa have concerns that the Army Corps is not creating these habitats in an ecological manner, but the Army Corps studies show there will only be minimal increases in nutrients carried by the river during project construction. If the Corps cannot put sediment into the Missouri River, it will have to dispose of the sediment in upland areas. There will be increased costs for each construction project. Disposal in upland areas would increase costs by requiring material to be placed in trucks and hauled off-site to upland disposal areas or placed adjacent to the habitat projects. Project costs would be increased by 300% to 500% depending on site specifics. So disposing of the sediment in upland areas will also result in increased negative environmental impacts. Disposal of material in upland areas will require disturbances of existing mitigation sites and increases the risk of damage to adjacent wetlands. It may also require additional land acquisition for disposal areas. For all these reasons, we have to oppose the amendment, and I yield back my remaining time.
The gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I would like to yield to my colleague from Iowa.
The gentleman.
I thank the gentleman from California for yielding, and I regret I didn't have that opportunity to sit down and talk to the gentlelady from Ohio regarding this dredging that's taking place in the Missouri River bottom in my district, in my neighborhood, where I spent my lifetime working on that river bottom and doing work like dredge work and dredge site work and dredge disposal site work. We've done a number of projects, the earth-moving side of this thing, working in conjunction with dredge contractors. I've been up and down every mile of this river for decades now. I've watched what they're doing. They would never let a private interest do what they are doing. They wouldn't let a public interest do what they were doing. Only the Corps of Engineers can do what they're doing. And I've not reviewed these numbers closely, but I did hear that it could be a 300% increase in the cost. I'd like to look at them more closely. I'm pretty confident King Construction can bid that substantially cheaper. However, we're not in the business of advocating what we do here in this Congress. The Corps of Engineers has often put out numbers that have been much higher than the actual cost necessary, and it's pretty simple to me that if you could see what I saw last week, a 20-inch pipe pumping out water and dredge spoil that's churned up by the dredge, the beater effect of the dredge, pumping that out into the middle of the river where the sediment is, the heavy stuff drops out right away. It starts to fill the channel. The lighter stuff goes down the river and gets settled out, and then the river has to be dredged again. They're putting that sediment in the river. It doesn't make it to New Orleans out into the Gulf of Mexico. It ends up having to be treated again. There's plenty of places for them to do this. They are contradicting their own policy. And so I urge the adoption of this amendment, and let's hold the Corps of Engineers accountable the same way they hold everyone else accountable. And I yield back to the gentleman from California as I thank him.
Madam Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Iowa. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Amendment number 1.
Amendment offered by Mr. Flores of Texas. At the end of the bill, before the short title, insert the following section. None of the funds made available by this act may be used to implement, administer, or enforce the national ocean policy developed under Executive Order number 13547 of July 19, 2010, 75 Fed Reg 43023 relating to the stewardship of oceans, coasts, and the Great Lakes.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, last year the House adopted my bipartisan amendment that would prevent agencies under the FY 2013 CJS Appropriations Bill from imposing ocean zoning related to the Obama administration's National Ocean Policy under Executive Order 13547. Executive Order 13547 was signed in 2010 and requires that various bureaucracies essentially zone the ocean and the sources thereof. This essentially means that a drop of rain that falls on your house can be subject to this overreaching policy because that precipitation will ultimately wind up in the ocean. The Department of Energy is a part of the National Ocean Council established under this executive order that has been tasked to zone the oceans. Concerns have been raised by many groups that the National Ocean Policy will restrict ocean and inland activities. It is also worrisome that the administration has not made any request for funds for this effort, nor has Congress appropriated any money for this purpose. We have had hearings in the Natural Resources Committee, and no agency has told us from what source they are getting the funding for this initiative. So where's the money coming from? Are they raiding existing accounts and diverting already scarce dollars from existing statutory responsibilities? On this chart, You can see that this executive order creates a huge new bureaucracy at a time when we're trying to make the government smaller, more efficient, more accountable, and less intrusive. The next chart lists the 63 agencies that are involved in this effort to try to zone the oceans. This looks like much more than a planning exercise at this point. Let me say that you're going to hear from the other side from time to time something that says that planning is good. Yes, planning may be good. Planning with the intent to effect a backdoor, non-statutory rulemaking is not good. And here's what the executive order states on its face. It says, all executive departments, agencies, and offices that are members of the Council and any other executive department, agency, or office whose actions affect the ocean, our coast, and the Great Lakes shall, to the extent consistent with applicable law, comply with Council-certified coastal and marine spatial plannings. That sounds like rulemaking to me that has not been authorized by statute. It's important to note that ocean zoning was debated during the 108th, the 109th, the 110th, and 111th Congresses, and each of those Congresses determined that this action was not necessary. This clearly indicates that Congress explicitly does not intend for the oceans to be zoned in the manner that the President is attempting to do so. Thus, Executive Order 13547 has no specific statutory authority, and there have been no appropriations by Congress to pay for the cost of this new bureaucracy. My similar amendment earlier this year passed by a bipartisan vote of 233 to 190 to the offshore energy package that we considered last month. This amendment was also adopted on a bipartisan basis as a part of the FY 2013 CJS appropriations bill. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this common sense amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I rise to oppose the amendment and to stress the importance of ocean policy. We are already seeing the threats posed by ocean acidification, low dissolved oxygen, harmful algal blooms, and dead zones in the Gulf, the Chesapeake Bay, Puget Sound, and throughout our nation's coastal waterways. The National Ocean Policy would help us better address the cumulative threats to our aquatic ecosystems from overfishing, coastal development, stormwater runoff, carbon emissions, and other pollutants entering our waterways. The implementation of the National Ocean Policy will help to protect, maintain, and restore our ocean and coastal ecosystems, which provide important jobs, food, recreation, and which serve as the foundation for a substantial part of our nation's economy. Only healthy, functioning, and resilient marine and freshwater ecosystems can support the fisheries we all depend upon so heavily. There are some reports that show that over half of the fish in the oceans have been fished out. And if you go to any supermarket, you're going to find on the shelves for the fish that are there strange names you've never even heard before, because so many of the varieties that were plentiful are simply fished out forever. The core approach of the National Ocean Policy is to improve stewardship of our oceans, coasts, islands, and Great Lakes by directing government agencies with differing mandates to coordinate and work better together. The National Ocean Policy creates no new authorities. It's about increased coordination among existing agencies, the sort of effect that should be taking place on a federal level in order to reduce inefficiency, waste, and redundancy between agencies. This is an issue of bringing people together so that all of the ocean's users, including recreational and commercial fishermen, boaters, industry, scientists, and the public, can better plan for, manage, harmonize, and sustain uses of oceans and coastal resources. And when you think about it, we now have 310 million people in our country. We look at the global populations in the billions. With the rate of population increase rising, more and more fishing going on, and how many of us come from regions where we see that fisheries have shut down? That in fact what used to exist in Massachusetts exists no more. That there are places on the West Coast where the fisheries that had been there are shut down. That's because there's so much draw on that life source in the ocean that we have to pay attention as a world how we are going to feed the generations of the future. This is not a casual engagement. This is downright serious business. And I would say that the gentleman's amendment is not forward-looking. I don't know what he has in mind here, but the better we understand what is going on and what Congressman Claude Pepper used to call Planet Ocean, where 70% of our Earth is actually water, much of it impinged now by pollutants and so forth, we have a responsibility to the globe. And this is not simple. Prior generations haven't had to think this way, but we have to think this way because there are many more draws on these resources, and look at the problems we've had with some countries going out and doing the fishing and just taking fish to one country and not allowing other fishermen to have equal access. Even in the Great Lakes that I represent, it's amazing. Every single year the number of fish you're allowed to catch goes down, because we've both got more fishermen because population is increasing, but there are fewer fish to draw from those lakes. And there are substantial threats in the form of invasive species. So the gentleman and I are on different sides of this. I think it's important to understand the oceans, to coordinate among our agencies to put the best intelligence forward, because the globe is changing, and we have to be smart enough to deal with those ecosystem changes. Thank you so very much, and I yield back my remaining time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Who seeks recognition?
Madam Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentleman from Texas has an amendment. The clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Mr. Flores of Texas. At the end of the bill, before the short title, insert the following section. None of the funds made available by this act may be used to implement, administer, or enforce Section 526 of the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, Public Law 110-140, 42 United States Code 17142.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise to offer an amendment which addresses another misguided and restrictive federal regulation. Section 526 of the Energy Independence and Security Act prohibits federal agencies from entering into contracts for the procurement of fuels unless their life cycle greenhouse gas emissions are less than or equal to emissions from an equivalent fuel produced from conventional petroleum sources. My simple amendment would stop the government from enforcing this ban on all federal agencies funded by the Energy and Water Development Appropriations Bill. The initial purpose of Section 526 was to stifle the Defense Department's plans to buy and develop coal-based or coal-to-liquids jet fuel. This restriction was based on the opinion of some environmentalists that coal-based jet fuel might produce more greenhouse gas emissions than traditional petroleum. However, one of the unintended consequences of Section 526 is that it essentially forces the American military to acquire fuel refined from unstable Middle East crude resources. Furthermore, Section 526's ban on fuel choice now affects all federal agencies, not just the Defense Department. This is why I'm offering this amendment again today to the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill. The American military and our federal agencies should not be burdened with wasting their time studying fuel restrictions when there's a simple fix. And that fix is to not restrict federal government fuel choices based on unsound policies and misguided regulations like those in Section 526. Section 526 also essentially makes our nation more dependent on Middle East oil. Stopping the impact of Section 526 will help us to promote American energy, grow the American economy, create American jobs, and become more energy secure. Madam Chair, it is also important to know what this amendment does not prevent and does not restrict, and it doesn't restrict or prevent the ability of the federal government from purchasing any alternative fuels, including biodiesel, ethanol, or other fuels from renewable resources. It places no restrictions whatsoever on those types of procurements. I offered this amendment to the Homeland Security Appropriations Bills and several appropriations bills during the 112th Congress, and they all passed on the floor of the House with strong bipartisan support. My friend Mr. Conaway also added similar language to the latest defense authorization bill to exempt the Defense Department from this burdensome regulation. I urge my colleagues to support the passage of this common sense amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Texas yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Bridenstine of Oklahoma. At the end of the bill, before the short title, insert the following section. None of the funds made available in this act may be used by the Corps of Engineers to set water storage prices for municipal use.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey
Madam Chair, I
seek
reserve a point of order on the gentleman's amendment.
The point of order is reserved. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise today to offer an amendment that will provide temporary relief and assurance for communities who otherwise will soon be hit by some of the sharpest increases in water storage prices ever seen. My amendment is simple. It prohibits the Army Corps of Engineers from using any official resources or funds to set new increased water storage prices for municipal use on any non-hydropower lake that was built by the Corps. The Corps would only be permitted to set the same rates on local communities that were in place when the lake was completed, a dollar figure that is well documented and not subject to any sort of interpretation by the Corps. A source of funding for the operation lakes owned by the Corps of Engineers is derived from water storage contracts with municipalities. The formula for pricing of water storage contracts on Corps lakes is defined legislatively as current costs. This fixed formula creates a prohibitive financial burden on the citizens of municipalities desiring to contract with the Corps, and as a result, the Corps does not receive any income for the operation and maintenance of the lake. In drought-stricken areas like Bartlesville, Oklahoma, the Corps' current flawed methodology threatens to raise water storage prices on local residents from around 6 cents to nearly $1 for the same 1,000 gallons of water. It also raises the total fiscal impact of water storage prices on Bartlesville from around $1.6 million a year to more than $24 million a year. Earlier this year, the Senate adopted by unanimous consent an amendment by Senator Inhofe to the WRDA bill that requires the GAO to complete a study on the Corps' outdated and flawed methodology when it comes to these water storage prices. As the WRDA bill develops in the House and hopefully moves toward conference and enactment, I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues on a long-term legislative solution to replace this outdated formula with one that is fair, reasonable, and affordable to all parties. By adopting this amendment today, we can provide one more year of certainty and assurance for communities like Bartlesville by ensuring that they do not see outrageous increases in their water storage prices and that they quite simply cannot afford. The American taxpayer spends billions of dollars every year to fund the operations of the Army Corps of Engineers, but by adopting this amendment, we can assure that none of those funds are used to enforce a formula that is outdated, unfair, and unjust as we move through the WRDA bill and other avenues toward a long-term solution. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek
Madam Chair, I insist on my point of order.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Chair, the amendment proposes a net increase in budget authority in the bill. The amendment is not in order under Section 3D3 of the House Resolution 5, 113th Congress, which states, "It shall not be in order to consider amendment to a general appropriations bill proposing a net increase in budget authority in the bill unless considered en bloc with another amendment or amendments proposing an equal or greater decrease in such budget authority pursuant to Clause 2F of Rule 21. The amendment proposes a net increase in budget authority in the bill in violation of such section. The Congressional Budget Office has stated that this amendment has costs associated with it. The Corps' current pricing policy is based upon, I quote, updated cost of storage, unquote, which reflects today's value indexed to current price levels rather than at the original construction cost price levels. So reverting to construction cost levels will unavoidably have a cost, with the net effect increasing the level of budget authority in the bill. Under Section 3D3, an increase in budget authority must be accompanied by an equal or greater decrease. This amendment does not contain an equal or greater decrease and so violates Section 3D3. I ask for a ruling from the Chair.
Does anyone wish to be heard on the point of order? If not, the Chair is prepared to rule. The gentleman from New Jersey makes a point of order that the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oklahoma violates Section 3D3 of House Resolution 5. Section 3D3 establishes a point of order against an amendment proposing a net increase in budget authority in the pending bill. The Chair has been persuasively guided by an estimate from the Chair of the Committee on the Budget that the amendment proposes a net increase in budget authority in the bill. Therefore, the point of order is sustained. The amendment is not in order. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Madam Chairwoman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairwoman, I rise only to say thank you to the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Frelinghuysen, who's been in this seat now for 38 days, it seems like. But the entire time of this bill, he has not taken a break for any reason during the entire consideration of these dozens of amendments and general debate. And I want to thank the chairman for doing a great job during this debate, but also in drafting the bill, along with his colleague, Marcy Kaptur, the ranking Democrat on the subcommittee. So, Mr. Chairman, we thank you for a job well done, and thank you for persevering through all of this. And also, I want to say a word of thanks to the staff, who deserve so much credit for the work that has been before the body for the last 2 days. Rob Blair, the clerk of the subcommittee, and all of the staff on both sides of the aisle have worked long and hard to bring this bill to the floor and to transpose it to the population of the House. So we thank you for a great job well done. And as we near the end of the deliberation on the amendments and final vote on the bill, I want to urge everyone to vote for this bill. This is a good bill. It cuts spending, it does the nation's business, and it's fair and transparent. And I urge the adoption of the bill and yield back.
The gentleman from Kentucky yields back the balance of his time. Pursuant